If you follow my previous research on the Samaritan Woman story, you'll see my progression from questioning the story's content to analyzing its structural makeup as a chiasm, along with some what-if scenarios and even an exploration of possible Buddhist influences on the story. In today's Noodle, we'll look at a radically different way to view the Samaritan Woman story in the Gospel of John chapter 4. Today, we'll study the story in terms of ancient Near East suzerainty treaties. John chapter 4 can be read as a treaty being negotiated and accepted between Jesus, the Judean king, the Messiah, and the region of Samaria represented by or as the woman at the well, if we suspend traditional readings of the story for a moment. Scholars have determined that these treaties, in their classic form, have 6 standard members. These components are 1. Introduction of the speaker, 2. Historical prologue, 3. Stipulations, 4. The document, 5. The gods, 6. Curse and blessing. Let's now look at these components as noted in Dennis J. McCarthy's book, Treaty and Covenant. In the introduction of the speaker section, we see noted that these are the words spoken by the king, and the king's name formally or explicitly mentioned. In the historical prologue, we see heredity mentioned and lands which were conquered. In the stipulations, we see both kings declaring obligations and punishments if obligations are not met. Regarding the document component, we see the laws and/or treaty language must be permanently written down and publicly read in the case of the Hittite Treaty, or clearly written down for understandable reading upon demand in the case of Deuteronomy. For the gods section, we see the gods mentioned only in the Hittite Treaty. However, in my opinion, Deuteronomy has already listed the god earlier in the stipulations section, when Yahweh is mentioned regarding the Passover obligation. In the curse and blessing section, we see what happens if the treaty is not honored, and we see what happens if the treaty is honored. I've created a table to show where portions of the Samaritan Woman story map to the 6 classic components of ancient Near East suzerainty treaties, along with the text we just reviewed from McCarthy's book. As you review the table, let me provide commentary on each of the sections I've mapped to the classic treaty structure. In verses 1, 9, and 10 of John chapter 4, we see Jesus introduced by the author of John as surpassing John the Baptist, as mentioned would be the case by John the Baptist himself earlier in John chapter 3, verse 30. By the Samaritan woman as a Judean, and by Jesus himself as someone who has access to the gift of God. That title later being disclosed in verse 26. In verses 5, 12, and 17 through 18, we see the author of John, the Samaritan woman, and Jesus give their versions of Samaria's history. The author describes the history as entwined with Jacob and Joseph. The woman describes the history more personally by describing our father Jacob, and rather than listing and naming only one son, she mentions his sons and his livestock. Jesus lists Samaria's past in marital terms when he mentions the current non-husband and the region's past 5 husbands. The men could be representative of Assyria, Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Hasmonean leadership, with Rome being the current non-husband. Or if taken from 2 Kings chapter 17, verses 24 through 41, the previous husbands could be Babylon, Cutha, Hamath, Ava, and Sepharvaim, with Rome generally still being the woman's current non-husband. In verses 20 through 23, we see the stipulations being addressed. Worship of the Father is decentralized and spiritualized. However, even though worship practices have been decentralized and spiritualized, Judeans are still the ones who provide salvation. Tersely put, you can see Jesus says, "You will worship the Father neither on this mountain nor in Jerusalem. We worship what we do know. Salvation is from the Jews. Worship the Father in spirit and in truth." In verses 25 through 29 and verses 41 and 42, we see signals of a document. Jesus, the Messiah, arrives and tells the woman everything she ever did. She says the Messiah will explain everything to us. The Samaritans later say to the woman, "We no longer believe just because of what you said. Now we have heard for ourselves." In verse 24, we see God succinctly defined as Spirit, as easily as we see God named by Moses in Deuteronomy. For the curse and blessings, we need to step back a bit into the story to verses 13 and 14, where Jacob's well water leads to recurring thirst, but Jesus' living water will perpetually quench thirst into the coming age. As you can see, if we hold traditional readings of the story constant for a moment and evaluate the story based on ancient Near East treaty structure, interesting resonances form. Now, I'm not saying it's a perfect one-to-one match. There are areas where I've stretched the comparisons, but overall, there are interesting areas of alignment. In my opinion, the strongest connections are with the historical prologue and stipulations. The next strongest are the Gods section and the Curse and Blessing section, followed by the document. Though the document could move up with more explanation, I do feel there's more nuance in the woman's phrasing, "He told me everything I ever did." Finally, the introduction of the speaker comes in last or weakest, given the king's credentials in John chapter 4 are slowly revealed rather than laid out fully at the beginning, as is the case with the ancient Near East treaties. Let me know what you think in the comments below as we continue to ask, what is the Samaritan Woman story?